is inequality a big deal? I've noticed you point out at one point, you showed on a slide that whereas inequality peaks at certain points corresponding to asset bubbles, the inequality levels with regards to wage inequality sort of flatlines, or does not really increase that dramatically. And you also shown that the inequality we have is very much driven by certain counties within the US then we're talking about, Silicon Valley, Washington, you name them. If I'm living elsewhere in the United States and I'm living on a decent wage, why would I be bothered by the fact that some billionaires in Silicon Valley are having tremendous returns on their capital? Why is inequality a problem, according to you? Should we be worried about it?
Now, I would argue that most people in the United States, and I live squarely in the center of the country, so I'm in an area where I'm not in Manhattan and I'm not in San Francisco, where you feel the strain of dealing with rich people every day. Most people in the United States are not that bothered at the level of their personal lives. And that's really not the issue. So long as public services are maintained, so long as Social Security is maintained, and so long as people have jobs, they are not going to be worried about inequality as such very much. They are going to be, there's an indirect effect because the inequality is part of this unstable system, which is clearly hitting people where they live. And when you get a political system that first cuts taxes and then cuts services, and this is felt then in the quality of the public schools or in the quality of the healthcare services and on and on and on, environmental conditions and everything else, then people are feeling the effects of it. And that, to me, is the problem. The problem of inequality is precisely that it leads to an extraordinarily distorted political system in the United States. And both parties, I used to work for the US Congress. I worked for a generation of congressmen and women who had long tenure and lots of political independence. They were backed by trade unions and civic organizations, and they, by and large, did what they thought was right. And when they, when they couldn't do it anymore, they retired. They were not spending every week out raising money for re-election campaigns. Even in the Senate, which was always worse than the House, this was not the case. And I knew many distinguished senators from 30 or 40 years ago. These days, it's a miserable job. It's just a miserable job. You spend all your time dialing for dollars, which means you are going around to receptions, drinking the wine, eating the oysters, and schmoozing with the lobbyists. And you don't have time to talk to your constituents or to get ideas from outside that circle. It's a lobby-driven, money-driven culture, and it has an enormous element of now secret billionaire slush funds which come into election campaigns at the last minute, which we've just seen. That is the consequence. Not so much of the change in the laws which permit unlimited use of money, but in the availability of unlimited money on the part of very small numbers of people. It's a consequence of having a highly unequal distribution of wealth and of disposable income. Most people cannot participate in the political process at the national level.
What is unambiguously the case is that poverty is bad. That if you have a lot of people below a certain income threshold, if you have high poverty, that is problematic. I mean, that's comparing like looking for some empirical evidence that is very weak and maybe statistically significant or not, against an issue where the evidence is very robust and very overwhelming. And that's why I say public policy should focus first and foremost on people at the bottom end, on people in poverty, on children in poverty, because it takes away from them the chances of a good education and a full life. That said, there are many good other reasons, I think, to worry about inequality because of justice reasons, because of legitimacy reasons. If the mechanisms that produce inequality are not just, then of course there is a problem. If you have bankers that become hideously rich by setting up all kinds of very sophisticated, opaque schemes that produce them big short-term gains, but that are no benefit to the rest of us, to the economy, to society. All kinds of sophisticated financial constructions, and they become very wealthy of them. I think there's a real problem there.
And I would like to contrast that with, of course, the solution that Professor Piketty puts forward, which is starting with a global progressive tax on income and wealth. And he will be the first to immediately say that this is a utopian idea. He calls it a useful utopian idea. But I sense that there is a large difference between how the two of you would tackle inequality and how Professor Piketty, or when he wants to tackle it through taxes. You two want to tackle it through the labor market and institutions. Is that correct?
To begin with, I do not see how one can have a useful utopian idea. The whole nature of utopian ideas is that they are intrinsically useless. Right? And Professor Piketty's proposal in this respect is not an exception to this rule. Right? It is a proposal which would occupy, I mean, it would be a full employment proposal because you could employ 2/3 of the people in this room to keep track of the minute-to-minute financial value of the assets held by the other third. Great. I can think of lots of better ways to use your time. There must be a few good opera singers and ballet dancers and cello players in the audience. It'd be much better use of your time. Right? The point of this is that we should be building policy on the basis of existing institutions with proven track records that do things that are known to work. Providing people with a high minimum wage is a proven strategy. Providing people with a secure retirement income and with adequate health insurance, these are proven strategies. Providing people with decent public education, this works. So one has to look at where it is a particular society deficient and how can one remedy that. And so that's a lot of piecemeal, undramatic things, but at least it has the advantage of not being useless and not being utopian.
I mean, we have a whole set of institutions and policies that bring us a relatively low level of inequality. That said, the point I made it in the beginning, we also have still a relatively high poverty rate. A lot of people living in poverty. Despite the fact that we have an extensive welfare state, that our government spending is among the highest in the OECD. We spend, I mean, our government sector is around 55% of GDP. We have a huge government. We have a huge welfare state. And still we have that 15% poverty rate. Now, raising additional money, and you can easily, even if you can institute it, a kind of wealth tax or wealth gain tax or whatever you would like to call it, that doesn't ensure that that money that will be raised will be distributed to people who most need it. The problem now with our welfare state, in my opinion at least, is that it caters to a large extent to the middle classes, that what my mental father, Herman de Leek, called the Matthew effect, that it is more alive and kicking than ever. And even if you would raise more government income, that doesn't guarantee that it would flow to the white people.
I favor ongoing taxation of corporate profits. This is a very useful thing to do. It makes the government, in effect, a shareholder in every private enterprise. But if there's no profits, there's no tax, which is reasonable. You don't have to sell a loss-making enterprise in order to pay tax. That would put a lot of struggling small businesses to the wall. It would force them to close, and that's not what you want to have accomplished. You tax profits when there are profits. Secondly, what is very useful, and is an institution which, so far as I can tell, is distinctively American, it dates back to Theodore Roosevelt, is you tax estates and gifts at death tax estates at death and gifts on an ongoing basis. But at a very high rate, the rate used to be about 55% for estates above a given size. I think it's down to 45 now. But you do that with the proviso that if you give away your accumulations while you're still living, then it escapes tax entirely. And you can give them to your university, to your hospital, to your church. You can create a foundation. You can do any number of approved things that are designated as tax-exempt activities. And the effect of that is to take a lot of capital wealth, which accumulates quite quickly in somebody's life when they go public with a company, for example, and turn it a few decades later into philanthropic expenditures. And there's lots more that could be done along those lines, but the American higher education system, the nonprofit healthcare system, and all these churches that we have all work on this principle, and they provide a great many jobs, as well as keeping young people in student status when they would otherwise be unemployed. Very useful things to have in the system. What you want with capital income is not necessarily to prevent it from being accumulated, but you want to force people to get rid of it relatively quickly so they don't maintain a continuing lockhold, among other things, on the political system. Now, we could improve our system. We could go back and do this much better. It's been attacked very heavily in the Bush years in particular by basically dynastic interests. But that's a useful thing. And the advantage over an annual tax on the financial wealth is you do it once, and you do it at a very definite time, which is to say when the wealth holder dies, which is usually a readily identified event. Then you appraise everything, and you have to sell it off. Well, it's the heirs start out with a little bit less or a lot less than they otherwise would have. They tend to get over that. It's not considered to be a taking from them. So that's a pretty good system. That's a good way to tax capital wealth, and it should be done more aggressively, and it should be done in more places. It's a very good way to fund museums, theaters, universities,